In December 2024, Russian soldiers are dying, its tanks are burning, and its economy is in freefall. Putin wanted to paralyze Ukraine, but the only thing he has paralyzed is Russia itself. In this video, we will show you all the ways this war has weakened Russia more than ever before. Let's start with Russia's oil and gas sector. Just before Putin launched the war in Ukraine, these two sectors were among Russia's most powerful assets. In January 2022, 1 month before the invasion, Reuters reported that Russian oil and natural gas sales had far exceeded all projections for 2021. These sales brought an enormous amount of money to Russia, representing more than a third of the national budget. As usual, Russia's energy sector was a thriving business. Revenues from oil and gas exceeded forecasts by 51.3%, generating $119 billion for the Russian economy. At one point in October, these two industries were raking in an impressive $500 million a day. Putin should have kept this revenue stream running. Nearly all of Europe depended on Russian oil and gas. According to the European Council, the EU imported nearly $75 billion worth of oil alone in 2021, accounting for about 2/3 of Russia's total sales for the year. Then, Putin invaded Ukraine, and much of those oil and gas sales vanished. Now, the EU has implemented a sweeping ban covering 90% of oil imports from Russia. It has also imposed a price cap on any Russian oil it buys, spending no more than $60 per barrel of crude oil, compared to the standard price of $72 per barrel. And it's not just Russian oil that's affected. In June 2024, the EU implemented sanctions on Russia's gas sector. These sanctions wouldn't stop Russian gas from flowing into EU countries. Europe still depends heavily on Russia for much of its gas. But what they would do is ban EU ports from reselling Russian gas to other countries after its arrival, in addition to blocking funding for Russia's liquefied natural gas terminals in the Baltic and Arctic. In other words, the major infrastructure projects Russia wanted to carry out won't happen, and it will lose sales to countries that were buying its gas solely to resell it at a higher price to other nations. This is a major blow. And the craziest thing is that Putin himself contributed to this massive economic loss. According to The Economist, Russia stopped much of its natural gas imports to Europe in 2022. It was a clever idea, in theory. Sending less meant prices skyrocketed, allowing Russia to earn more despite reducing its export volumes. Russia hoped to make Europe so dependent on its 40% share of natural gas that it would become desperate enough to hesitate in supporting Ukraine. However, that didn't happen. Instead, Russia found itself struggling to redirect the 180 billion cubic meters of gas it would have otherwise sold to Europe elsewhere. It also lacked the necessary facilities to store this gas at temperatures below -256 degrees Fahrenheit, essentially rendering the gas it produced unsellable. Fast forward 2 years, and the EU is also sanctioning this gas, making it even harder for Russia to sell one of its most valuable resources. Why does all of this matter in the context of Russia's paralysis? It's simple. There's a lot less money flowing into the country than before Putin launched his special military operation. Not only does this mean Putin lacks the cash to properly fund his war machine, but it also means Russia cannot invest in two of its most profitable industries. There's no money or equipment to explore new oil and gas fields, and as the world moves increasingly toward greener energy sources, it's likely that demand for gas will outpace oil, at a time when the EU is significantly cutting back its purchases of Russian gas. The country does have options. The Power of Siberia pipeline serving China is increasing its capacity, and a second Power of Siberia pipeline is reportedly in the works. But even that won't save Russia's gas industry. According to Sergei Vakulenko, a former oil executive at Russian state giant Gazprom, China might choose to wait until 2025 or 2026, when liquefied natural gas supplies open up from Qatar and the US. If it does, Russia would earn $257 per cubic meter of gas from China in 2027, down from $320 per cubic meter today. Moreover, Gazprom must recoup its investment in the Power of Siberia pipelines, meaning it would have to run them at full capacity for 20 years just to break even. All this adds up to a paralyzed oil and gas industry for Russia. The Economist asserts that Russia may never recover the lucrative oil and gas industries it once had in Europe after the war in Ukraine ends. European countries have already found alternatives and are massively reducing their reliance on Russian products. Even with China buying from Russia, it will be at a discounted rate, meaning Russia will never regain the record revenues it recorded in 2021. This is terrible news for a country already financially drained by Putin's war. The Russian leader has inadvertently damaged Russia's most profitable sector while plunging his country into economic chaos to fund his war. As a result, Russia will become a much poorer country, unable to rely on what were once its two largest industries to recoup the money Putin has wasted. And it gets worse for Russia. In March 2024, Defense News reported that Russian arms sales had dropped even further. It states that the country saw a 53% decline between 2014 to 2018 and 2019 to 2023. Western sanctions due to the war in Ukraine played a huge role in this decline. So did Russia's declining reputation as a country capable of manufacturing quality weapons. China cut its purchases by 39%, with Egypt buying 54% fewer weapons during this period. Even Algeria and Vietnam, previously Russia's third and fourth largest customers, exported 83% and 91% fewer Russian weapons, respectively, between 2019 and 2023 than they did between 2014 and 2018. Why did this happen? Part of the reason is that Russia needs as many weapons as possible for the war in Ukraine. A nearly 3-year campaign was not what Putin had anticipated, so many of the weapons he would have sold to other countries now have to remain in Russia. But this doesn't explain the fact that Russian arms sales were already in decline before Putin started his special military operation. There's something else at play here, a truth many Russian buyers had already realized, and that the war in Ukraine has blatantly highlighted. Russia no longer makes good weapons. If the war in Ukraine has proven anything, it's that Russia's most advanced weapon systems are not capable of helping it defeat a country supposedly far inferior to it in military power. Even with massive aid from the West, Putin's propaganda focused on the superiority of Russian weapons over those supplied by NATO. That superiority does not exist. Countries like China and India recognized this before the war began, which is why they drastically cut their arms purchases. Add sanctions to this mix, which mean former Russian clients won't buy from the country because of its actions in Ukraine, and you get another struggling industry. Russia can no longer even rely on arms sales in sub-Saharan Africa. This region, ravaged by civil wars and conflicts, was a lifeline for Russia's struggling arms industry before the war in Ukraine. Russia accounted for 26% of all sales in the region between 2018 and 2022. That share dropped to 17% between 2019 and 2023, showing that the war in Ukraine, by revealing the weakness of Russian weapons, has affected its military industry. Certainly, this decline comes at a time when African countries are importing 52% fewer weapons overall. However, this loss of market share alone indicates that Russia has rapidly fallen out of favor with countries still looking to buy arms, with China surpassing it as the main supplier. Where does that leave Russia today? The war in Ukraine has paralyzed 3 of the country's most powerful industries. Oil, gas, and arms sales have all declined compared to the past, and there seems to be little prospect of recovery once the Ukrainian conflict ends. This war has been the trigger for these declines, with sanctions being the main culprits. Furthermore, when it comes to Russian weapons, the conflict has shown that Russia no longer produces arms as effectively as Western countries supporting Ukraine. Russia's clients are fleeing in large numbers, taking with them the money they would have spent. That money could have helped sustain Russia's struggling economy. Without this influx of funds, Russia is further deteriorating by continuing Putin's special military operation. The country is becoming increasingly impoverished, finding itself in dire economic straits, whether it wins or loses the war. Moreover, the war in Ukraine has also greatly affected the value of the Russian ruble. The impact was almost immediate, according to the Wall Street Journal. Just hours after Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border, the Russian stock market lost about half its value, and the ruble dropped by 8%. This brought it to its lowest level since March 2020, a period when the country was reeling from market panic due to COVID-19. Fast forward to October 2024, and the situation still hasn't improved for Russia and its ruble. On October 10th, Reuters reported that the ruble had collapsed again, reaching 97.40 rubles per dollar, a level unseen since October 2023. The currency also fell by 1.29% against the Chinese yuan. The Moscow Times also covered this drop in currency value, stating that Russian authorities had almost resigned themselves to seeing their country's currency drop beyond the 100 ruble per dollar mark by the end of the year. However, a falling currency isn't always bad news for a country. Indeed, the Moscow Times claims that the low exchange rate could benefit the Russian state budget, which is preparing to spend even more than the billions already committed to an invasion initially expected to last only a few days. However, a sharply falling currency brings many negative economic shocks. Imports become more expensive, forcing Russia to spend more to acquire what it needs to function. The ruble has lost purchasing power, which translates to reduced access for ordinary Russians to foreign products they would otherwise have been able to afford. Conversely, Russian exports become even cheaper for other countries. Normally, this could be beneficial under normal conditions, as lower prices would allow the country to export more goods. However, this is not what Russia hoped for. Sanctions imposed due to the war in Ukraine are preventing the country from exporting the volume needed to stop the ruble's value from continuing to fall. What does all this mean for Russia's future? Skyrocketing inflation coupled with extremely high interest rates. Prices in Russia have consistently increased since the war in Ukraine began. Statista reports that inflation reached a staggering 17.8% in April 2022, just a few months after the war began. It has significantly decreased since then, but far from what the country would consider a healthy level. The Central Bank of Russia targets an annual inflation rate of 4%. In October 2024, Russia's inflation rate stood at 8.5%, more than double the target rate. Once again, the war in Ukraine has played its role in all of this. Western sanctions are the main cause of this high inflation. This equates to the average Russian living in a country experiencing a cost of living crisis that will not go away when the war in Ukraine ends. The sanctions are likely to remain, whether Russia or Ukraine wins the war. Russia will have to rebuild in so many areas that it seems likely the poor will only get poorer in the coming decades. And these ordinary Russians don't even have the option of borrowing money to ease their financial hardships. On October 25, 2024, Le Monde reported that Russia had raised its base interest rate to 21%. That's the highest rate since 2003, when Putin was trying to revitalize the country's economy, and it is expected to rise even further. Trading Economics predicts that the interest rate in Russia will reach 23% by the end of 2024. The Central Bank of Russia had to react, stating that further monetary policy tightening is needed to bring inflation back to target and reduce inflation expectations. It also indicated that rates will continue to rise, in line with Trading Economics forecasts. Currently, the bank has not directly attributed the rate hikes to the war in Ukraine. Instead, it mentioned high government spending as the cause of this increase. These high expenditures are a direct consequence of the war in Ukraine. Worse for Russia, this conflict has triggered a wage price spiral as prices rise, with interest rate hikes failing to curb inflation because the Russian economy now heavily depends on government spending for its offensive in Ukraine. The more Russia invests in fighting Ukraine, the higher inflation rises, and the more interest rates have to climb. In summary, it's simple. Putin is on the verge of bankrupting Russia. His actions have paralyzed the oil and gas industries, making them much less profitable than they were in 2021. Worse still, Russia will be forced to sell its gas to China in the future at prices lower than today despite inflation. The Russian citizen now lives in a time where the cost of goods is spiraling out of control while wages stagnate. They can't even borrow money at reasonable rates. The interest on those loans will only keep rising. All this leads to a grim economic future for Russia, and the situation won't improve even if Russia wins the war in Ukraine. Why? Because with victory comes the heavy cost of rebuilding the country it has spent nearly 3 years destroying. In February 2024, the World Economic Forum estimated that the cost of rebuilding Ukraine would be $486 billion if the war had ended at that moment. Of course, it didn't. The cost of rebuilding has likely surpassed $500 billion so far, with over 2 million homes, 300 bridges, and more than 8,000 kilometers of Ukrainian roads all requiring repairs. Remember, destroying Ukraine wasn't Putin's goal. He wanted to control the country and integrate it into Russia, as was done during the Soviet era. So, if he succeeds, he'll have to rebuild, or everything he's done since February 2022 risks bankrupting his country by turning Ukraine into a wasteland. The main question is, where will this money come from? Foreign investment in Russia has dropped dramatically. It fell by $8.7 billion in the first 3 quarters of 2023 alone, and Putin's actions have destroyed all of Russia's major industries. The war is the only thing keeping Russia afloat. Once it's over, whether Russia wins or loses, a massive reconstruction bill awaits, and Russia won't be able to afford to pay it. Economist Renaud Foucault states, "A prolonged stalemate could be the only way for Russia to avoid total economic collapse." Ukraine will not accept an end to the war where Russia remains on its territory. Russia is in a bad position. The cost of rebuilding Ukraine keeps increasing, while the country drains its limited financial resources. This fragile situation will lead to a collapse. Russia will eventually have to face its own economic reality in a new world where it has become a geopolitical pariah. This is another reason why the war in Ukraine will lead to Russia's collapse. Its military is no longer what it once was. We can look at this from 2 angles, ideological and practical. On one hand, Russia has failed to defeat a smaller country that its army should have crushed. Even with Western aid, Putin's return to World War I-era trench warfare shows that Russia's military spending produces little results. It's stuck in a form of warfare that other major world powers have moved beyond decades ago. This doesn't mean Russia is no longer seen as a threat. It still has nuclear weapons after all. However, the element of fear its conventional army instilled over the years has disappeared, indicating that Russia no longer holds the same level of influence it once had on the geopolitical stage. It's a country that has always relied on projecting power to influence the rest of the world. These projections are no longer what they were because Russia has revealed itself to be a paper tiger. On a practical level, the war Putin has waged has completely depleted the Russian army. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, or Minfin, this has cost Russia 720,000 people dead or wounded fighting against Ukraine. More than 20,000 artillery systems have been lost, with a similar number of armored vehicles destroyed. Russia has lost more than 9,300 tanks, according to Minfin, as well as 999 air defense systems. As an unnamed Western official stated in February 2024, Russia's domestic munitions production capabilities are currently insufficient to meet the needs of the conflict in Ukraine. It's not just weaponry that's an issue on this front. Artillery and tanks are also depleting, with Semaphore pointing out that Russia simply does not have the means to replenish them. Citing The Economist, it states, "The Soviet-era arms supply chain no longer exists," noting that Russia cannot source the materials needed to manufacture weapons as it did in the 1980s. Sanctions aren't helping this situation, and the West is likely to maintain its sanctions regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine. So, where does that leave Russia's military for the future? Russia is severely weakened, to the point that Putin is struggling to deploy the weapons needed in Ukraine. That's why he has to rely on other countries, such as North Korea and China, to supply his army. These nations provide the weapons, and the soldiers, in North Korea's case, that Russia is struggling to secure. Once the war ends, Russia's influence will be far less than it was before because its conventional army will no longer be as powerful as it should be. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have lost their lives, and tens of thousands of pieces of equipment have been destroyed as part of the special military operation. Rebuilding all of this will take several decades at best. Moreover, with Russia's economic woes and fragile financial situation, it is unlikely to have the funds needed to quickly rebuild its army. Russia's military and its reputation have been irreparably damaged by the war in Ukraine. According to Rand, the perception of the quality of its army and the effectiveness of its arsenal has been altered. It describes the country's ground combat strategies and equipment as dubious, as evidenced by the previously mentioned figures concerning the decline in arms exports. It also highlights that endemic corruption is at the core of all these weaknesses. Whatever the reason, the Russian army, supposedly at its peak, has demonstrated inadequate planning and training during the war in Ukraine. That's why Putin has fallen back on his brutal approach. He had no other tactics because Russia simply isn't as efficient a war machine as he wanted the rest of the world to believe. This lack of military strength will prove decisive for Russia's future. NATO is better prepared to handle a Russian attack than it has been in a long time. In 2024, 23 of NATO's 32 members will meet or exceed the organization's target of spending 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. This compares favorably to a meager 7 that hit the target in 2022. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only strengthened NATO, exactly the opposite of what Putin wanted to accomplish from a power play perspective. Worse for Russia, NATO is strengthening at a time when Russia's army is weakened and its economy is on the brink of collapse. Putin has put his country in the pockets of other nations, North Korea and China, just to keep his military operational. When the war in Ukraine ends, these countries will expect Russia to repay its debts, while Russia faces a Europe far more prepared, regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of Russia's declining population. A lot of people. Over 700,000 so far in the war. Between 370,000 and 700,000 Russians have fled the country to avoid military conscription or because they disagreed with Putin's special military operation. As Rand points out, many of those affected are among Russia's brightest and most talented individuals, meaning Putin has condemned his country to a future marked by a lack of innovation and a labor shortage. Some estimates predict that Russia's population will be just 125 million by 2050, a decrease of about 21 million from current figures. All this leads to a grim future for Russia. The country's economy is paralyzed, and any prospect of the war in Ukraine ending threatens to completely destroy it, as it is now almost entirely focused on the conflict. Russia's oil and gas sectors will never recover the highs they reached before the war, and its chaotic military performance in Ukraine will only harm its arms export business. The country's stock market is unstable. The ruble has collapsed amid high inflation and exorbitant interest rates. Russia's army is depleting both in equipment and personnel, the latter issue leading to labor shortages and demographic changes for decades to come. Russia, as we know it, is paralyzed, whether it wins or loses in Ukraine. But what does the future hold for Russia? Will the country manage to recover from its losses, both in terms of its geopolitical image and more tangible damages? Or are we witnessing the final collapse of a former superpower, all because of a small country Putin thought he could overwhelm in a few days?